Hey, what's going on, you guys? Do me a favor. Take a look at this question and tell me what you notice. And most of you are going to say, well, I see that this question is testing me on verbs because the answer choices has verbs in them, right? That'd be absolutely correct. Now, my next question is, what do you think of next when you know you're being tested on verbs? Take a moment, pause, and really consider this. Some of you are going to say, well, I don't know. I think about solving the question, right? Some of you are going to say, well, maybe I think about what I'm going to have for dinner, right? Some of you, though, most of you are probably going to say, I think about verb tenses. Or do I think about the past tense, or do I use the present tense or the future tense, right? I think that verb tenses is the first thought that comes into your mind when you think about verbs. And this is not just my wild guess. It's because I've worked with over 7,000 students and I've asked these students. These students range, right, from all different types of ability levels, right? From students who just started learning English about a year ago to students who grew up in the States and lived there for over 10 years, right? And these students goes to very prestigious boarding schools, right? Or private schools in the United States. Now, these students, most students will tell me, right, that almost always the first thought that comes into their mind is, which tense should I use? And if you're in that same line of thinking, I'm telling you that your thinking, it's not that your thinking is incorrect, but it's just that your thinking is making it harder for you to get verb questions correct on the SAT. Now, if I know that at times, right, the verbs are easy to answer and you know the answer really, really quickly, right? And in other times, maybe they're kind of confusing, right? There might be some cases where you answer verb questions really quickly, but then you look back at the answer and you notice you got that question incorrect. You got it wrong. But then you might ask yourself, right, well, what did I do incorrectly, right? And the one thing that I found, the biggest thing that I found that most students do incorrectly is that they think about verb tenses first. And so this is where I want to get you guys to kind of reframe your thinking. I want you guys to adjust the dials of your thinking a little bit. I'm not asking you guys to come up with a completely new strategy, but I'm just asking you guys to kind of change your thinking a little bit, or at least change the order of your thinking a little bit. Right now, just trust me when I tell you guys this. And there is a sort of method. There's a reason to my madness, right? Part of it is not only have I spent over 10,000 hours really studying this test, right? The SAT, the ACT, and standardized exams in general. I've also taken multiple standardized exams and scored in the 99th percentile of the English sections of these tests. I've also worked with over 7,000 students, and I really try to get into the minds of my students, right? Because if I can get into your minds and know what you're thinking, I can help to kind of adjust or correct that thinking. So all of this stuff is based on sort of science and experiments that I've done with a lot of my kids over the past 14 years or so, and a lot of the sort of thinking that I did with myself, right, in my journey of taking this test. Okay, so first and foremost, you guys, do not think about verb tenses first. Now, here's going to be why. There's two reasons why. Number one, verb tenses are the hardest, it's the hardest thing that you have to think about when you're solving verb questions. Okay, so when you're dealing with verbs, verb tenses is the most challenging aspect of verbs. So don't think about that first. You want to think about that last. Okay, and the second reason is because the SAT, because verb tenses is the least frequently tested concept on the SAT, right? Especially, during module 1, and especially if you get easy version of modules 2. Now, as the test gets harder, if you get the hard version of modules 2, you might see a little bit more verb tenses that you're being asked. But for the most part, like on average, in general, verb tenses are the least commonly tested verb concept, right, on the SAT. So this is what you have to know. Right? There's 3 different ways that the SAT can test you on verbs, right? The first way is called subject-verb agreement, right? The second way is called verb forms, and the third way is verb tenses, okay? So the way that you should be thinking when you know that you're being tested on verbs is, right, think to yourself, okay, am I being tested on subject-verb agreement first? And then if you are, then great, go with that. If you're not, then ask yourself, am I being tested on verb forms? Right? If you are, great, go with that. If not, then you ask yourself, third question, right? Am I being tested on verb tenses? Okay. So you want to be thinking about verbs in that order. right? Now, you might be asking me, the next logical question is going to be, well, Jin teacher, well, how do you know when you're being tested on verb, subject-verb agreement, or verb forms, or verb tenses? I mean, that's an excellent sort of question, okay? So there's a couple of parts to this answer. So when we're being tested on subject-verb agreement, so I'm going to say, let's say subject, verb, agreement. So this concept is pretty straightforward, right? It is kind of what it sounds like, right? So this just tells you that your subject and your verb have to agree in number. In other words, a singular subject must always take a singular verb, and a plural subject must always take a plural verb, okay? Well, this is the first concept. This is the first thing that you want to think about when you're being tested on verbs. Right now, how do you know you're being tested on subject-verb agreement? I want you guys to take a look at the answer choices and try to notice any difference in singular and plural verbs, okay? As sing, it means singular. Singular just means one, right? And plural, PL, just means more than one. Okay, so I want you guys to look at your answer choices and notice, can you notice a difference between a singular and plural verbs, right? In between two of your answer choices at least. Okay, so everyone can do this. If you take a look at your answer choices, just take an overview, right? Just take an overarching view of your answer choices, a high-level view of your answer choices. You guys will see that, okay, well, answer choice A is a singular verb, right? Do you guys notice any other singular verbs? You guys probably say, well, yeah, D, right? Is a singular verb, okay? When you have these verb pairs like this, like was deemed or is deemed or are deemed, don't look at the second word, deemed. Look at the first word to notice if it's singular or plural. Okay, so was deemed, was is singular, so you know this is going to be a singular verb, okay? And then what about for plural verbs, right? So we notice that were is the plural verb, right? The plural verb form of was, right? So, boom, right? We do know, so as soon as you notice, and it doesn't have to do with all of the answer choices, but if you notice a difference between two answer choices, where one answer choice has a singular verb and the other one has a plural verb, then you know without a shadow of a doubt that one of the concepts that the SAT is testing you on is subject-verb agreement. So go ahead and check for that, okay? So now, how do you solve for subject-verb agreement? Now, I'll get to that in just a second. Before I do, I want to also let you guys know that the SAT can, right, and oftentimes does, test you on more than one concept for a single question. Okay, so for this particular question, the SAT is testing you on two specific concepts of verbs. So the general concept is verbs. That's the broad category. But beneath this broad category, we have two specific subsets of verbs that they're testing you on. So one of those subsets of verbs that they're testing you on is subject-verb agreement. The other one is going to be verb tenses, right? And so I'll get to that. I'll get to that after we work through subject-verb agreement. But this is a very big tip that I want you guys to know. When you know that the SAT is testing you on more than one concept, work on solving just one concept at a time. Just focus on doing things one thing at a time. Don't try to work on, right, solving both concepts at the same time. You're only going to confuse yourself. Do things one thing at a time, right? So if you know you're being tested on subject-verb agreement, boom, that's enough to start with. Okay, so now the next logical question is, well, Jin teacher, how can you solve for subject-verb agreement, right? Well, in order to solve for subject-verb agreement, you have to find the subject of this verb. So you ask yourself the question, right, what was deemed, right? So what was deemed? So the what is going to be the subject, right? And the logical answer is going to be the subject of this verb, right? So if you ask yourself, well, what was deemed? You're going to have to read the sentence, right, to figure out what the subject of this verb is, right? So if we do that here, it says its discordant polytonal score combined with VN's avant-garde choreography, right, was deemed scandalous. Okay, so here, well, what was deemed scandalous? Well, we know it's going to be the score, okay? So we know that score is a singular subject, right? A singular subject because we know it only refers to just one thing, right? It's just a score. It's not scores, right? But it's just score, So we know it's referring to just one thing. So we know it's a singular subject. Well, then we know that a singular subject must always take a singular verb, right? So because we know the correct answer has to be a singular verb, we can cross out our plural verb answers. So we can get rid of B and C immediately because these are the plural verb forms, right? So now you might be asking yourself, well, you might be asking or wondering, well, Jin teacher, well, how come the subject is just score and why is it not score and choreography, right? Well, it's an excellent question. Well, this is one of the things you have to know. The subject of the verb, right? The subject of a sentence, right, will never be found inside of non-essential information. Okay, non-essential information just means that it's information that's not necessary, right? Usually, non-essential information is going to be surrounded by two commas. And you can kind of tell it's non-essential based off of how the sentence reads, right? So if you read the sentence, it's discordant polytonal score combined with, right? So you notice we have this comma here after score, right? And so we know that this is where we get the non-essential, okay? The non-essential information is going to end here. We know it's not essential because we wouldn't read this as one fluid thought, right? We wouldn't say it's score combined, right? Plus we have the comma there that kind of tells us that, wait a second, we need this pause or this break. We have non-essential information coming up, okay? So what I'm saying is if this information is non-essential, the one that I underlined, then what I'm saying is the subject of the sentence is never going to be found inside of non-essential information. So what does that mean? None of these words in here is going to be the subject of the sentence, right? So this is why choreography, even though it's a noun, it's not the subject of this verb. Because why? It's inside of non-essential information. Okay, so write that down. Subjects will never be found inside of non-essential information, okay? So that's why I know that the subject is just score, which is just singular, okay? So now that I'm able to cross out B and C, next, you got to ask yourself, well, what else is the SAT testing you on, right? So now that we only have singular verbs left, right, now we have to think about what's the difference between these verbs, right? Well, the difference between is and was is, well, is present tense and was is past tense. So we know that the second concept that the SAT is testing us on is verb tenses. Now we can think about verb tenses, right? But notice how if we thought about verb tenses first, right, that might make this question a little bit harder. A lot of times, it's not necessary for you to even think about verb tenses because you can find the correct answer to verbs, right, by just figuring out subject-verb agreement and verb forms. Right now, there are some cases, of course, where you have to consider verb tenses because that is one of the things that the SAT does test you on. But my argument is, or my position is, you don't always have to think about that, and you don't always have to think about that first. In fact, it's disadvantageous for you to think about that first because it's the hardest concept to figure out, and it's the one that's least frequently tested. So if it's the one that's not most commonly tested, and it's the one that's the most difficult to figure out, why the heck would you think about that first? It makes no sense to me, right? So don't do that, okay? But now that we have no choice, right, to think about verb tenses, well, it becomes pretty straightforward. So what are the clues? Then now, naturally, the question that students will ask me is, well, Jin, how do you solve for verb tenses, right? Well, then what you have to figure out or what you have to pay attention to is what I call context clues. Okay, so context is going to be king on the SAT. What exactly is context? Context just means surrounding information. It's the information that is around, right, the underlined blank, right? So it could be words that are not underlined in the sentence that the underlined blank is a part of, or sometimes context could mean it's the words in other sentences where the underlined blank is not part of, right? So anyways, context, though, is going to be king on the SAT. You know, every single correct answer on the SAT is going to be based off of some context, right? Some information in the text, okay? And so your job is to figure out, well, hey, what's the key information in the context? Right? I call this context clues, right? So for every single question type or concept that you're tested on, there's different types of context clues that you have to pay attention to, right? So for example, subject-verb agreement, right? The context clue was we have to find the subject, right? So the subject score, that's the context clue. That's the key piece of information that you need to solve to figure out, do I need a singular or a plural verb, okay? So now, what about for verb tenses? What are the context clues here? Well, there's two context clues that you want to pay attention to. One of those I call time references. Okay, so references to time, right? So am I talking about, so if I said yesterday, that's a time reference clue, right? So if I say yesterday, you know I'm referring to the past. So I want to use past tense verbs. If I say 20 years from now, you know I'm referring to the future, right? So you know that time reference is referring to something that hasn't happened yet, right? And so time references is something that you want to pay attention to for verb tenses, right? Because the time that's being referenced in the sentence that the underlined blank is a part of is going to determine which tense you use, right? It's very logical to think about it like that, okay? The second thing that you want to think about, though, is going to be other verbs, right? Other verbs. And you want to think about, well, what tense are these other verbs written in, right? Because usually you want to keep your verb tenses consistent, right? So if a writer is talking about a subject, and if he's using the present tense to talk about this subject in a paragraph, right? You know, logically, you want to keep those verb tenses consistent or the same, right? Now, that's only if, right, there aren't references to time that tell you that verbs should be written in another tense. Okay, but for the most part, when you have these other verbs that are written in certain tenses, you want to make sure that your verb, the verb that you're looking for, is going to be written in that same tense. Okay? But again, the way that you want to think about context clues for verbs is going to be in this order, right? Time references first, and then from there, other verbs. Okay? Work through it systematically like that. So how does that look for this particular question? Well, we know that this paragraph is talking about this Igor's something, this ballet, and we're talking about it. It's saying that this ballet premiered in 1913. And so we know it's referencing the past, right? And also the writer writes about this ballet in the past tense, right? This ballet incited a riot, right? We also know that the score, it says that it irrevocably altered, right, the course of 20th century music. So there's a couple of things. There's time references that refer to the past, where they're talking about this ballet in the past tense, right? And also the other verbs are written in the past, right? So we know that the correct verb tense that we should be using is the past tense and not the present tense, right? So this is why we got to get rid of D here. And this is why a correct answer is going to be A for this particular question, okay? So good, you guys. So this is how you solve the question systematically. Well, is it going to take 15 minutes? No, of course not, right? It's going to take you less than 30 seconds if you're doing this, if you get enough practice or repetitions with this, right? But the key points to remember, you guys, is number one, right? Don't think about verb tenses first, right? We know why. It's the hardest to solve, and it's the one that's least frequently tested. Okay, so what should we be thinking about first? Subject-verb agreement, right? Singular, plural verbs. Okay. Then another key clue, another key sort of piece of information or knowledge is, right, you want to focus on things one thing at a time, right? So if you know that, okay, the SAT is testing me on subject-verb agreement, go ahead and start with that first, right? And just try to get rid of answer choices, right, based off of that concept, right? We did that here, right? We knew that the subject was singular, so we knew that we got rid of the plural verbs, okay? And then from there, once you're done with that concept, then you focus on the next thing, right? So we're focusing on one thing at a time, one thing at a time. That's very helpful for students who get really overwhelmed, right? They're not sure where to start, right? Well, you start with the smallest step, right? You start by taking one step forward with the smallest thing, right? And that smallest thing is usually going to be, right, something that you recognize or something you're most confident about. Start with that thing first, right? On the SAT, I just tell my students, hey, this is why it's really important for you guys to take a look at the answer choices before you read the passage, because the answer choices give you a very good clue as to what you're being tested on. And if you know you're being tested on verbs, specifically subject-verb agreement, then you know now specifically what to read for, okay? Then once you solve for that, then you can go ahead and figure out the second thing that you're being tested on, and then go ahead and solve for that as well, all right? So that's going to be the sort of the high level, the top 1% strategy. And then I've taught this to all of my students, and it's been really, really helpful, especially for students who struggle with verbs. So if you're in that category, this is going to help you guys out tremendously. I know this for sure. Guys, I want you guys to do me a couple of favors. Number one, in the comment section, please tell me one thing that you guys learned, maybe that was new or something that really helped you out. right? Write that down in the comment box below. 2, please tell me one thing that you want to learn, right? Something that you're still kind of like unsure about, and try to articulate, try to explain it very clearly, right? And then 3, you guys, please do me a favor. I'm trying to help millions of people get top 1% SAT instruction, to give them the knowledge and the tools to get fewer than 5 questions wrong consistently on the SAT. That is my mission, and I need your guys' help. So please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and please share it with somebody who needs it. It really helps spread the word to students like you who are trying to maximize your potential on this test. The more that you guys help in this way, the more excited I feel, the more juiced up I get to want to help you guys out, the more powerfully that I show up, right? The more that I do for you, the more you're going to get out of this, right? But it's basically a two-way street, and you need your guys' help in this matter. Anyways, you guys, that'll do it for me. Remember, my name is Jin Teacher. Please let me know if there's anything that I can do to help you guys out. And also, you guys, make sure to always stay curious and never stop learning. You guys got this. Take care. Until the next video.